in the shadow of giants, where the echoes of revolution still whispered through the halls of power, a new kind of politician emerged. One who didn't wield a sword or pen immortal declarations, but mastered something far more dangerous: the art of political illusion. His name? Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. A man who didn't just play the game of power, he reinvented it. To some, he was a master strategist, the little magician who pulled presidents from his hat. To others, a cunning manipulator, weaving webs of patronage and party loyalty. But beneath the polished veneer of this political maestro lay a story of ambition, betrayal, and the birth of modern American politics as we know it. Born in 1782 in the quiet Dutch village of Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren was no son of revolution. No, his family weren't founding fathers, they were tavern keepers, and it was here, in the smoky back rooms of his father's inn, where young Martin learned his first lessons in power: how to listen, how to persuade, and most importantly, how to make men believe they were getting what they wanted, while he got what he needed. By the time he was a young lawyer, Van Buren had already grasped a truth that would define his career. Politics wasn't about ideals, it was about organization. While others gave grand speeches, he built machines. In the turbulent era after the War of 1812, as America's first political parties crumbled, Van Buren saw an opportunity, and from the ashes, he would forge a new political empire, the Democratic Party. But how did a man with no military glory, no vast wealth, and no famous name rise to the highest office in the land? The answer lies in a skill few of his contemporaries possessed: the ability to make enemies and then turn them into allies. And his greatest performance was only just beginning. Politics, in the hands of Martin Van Buren, was not a matter of chance. It was a science. And in the laboratories of New York's back rooms, he engineered a new kind of power, not with muskets or manifestos, but with lists. Lists of names, of debts, of favors, a machine built to win. This was the birth of the Albany Regency, Van Buren's political machine. A web of loyalty so precise, so unbreakable, that it didn't just influence elections, it decided them. Judges, mayors, even governors danced to the tune of the little magician. And if they stepped out of line, well, the machine had a way of reminding them who held the strings. But Van Buren's ambitions stretched far beyond New York. The old political order, the era of founding fathers, was crumbling. The Federalists had faded, and the Democratic Republicans were tearing themselves apart. Into this chaos, Van Buren saw his moment. He didn't just want to join a party, he wanted to build one. His plan? A party not of elites, but of the people, or at least the illusion of it. The Democratic Party, born from backroom deals and barnstorming campaigns, a party that could win not just in the parlors of Boston, but in the frontier towns of the West. And to lead it, he needed a figurehead, a man with a legend. Enter Old Hickory, Van Buren and Jackson, an unlikely alliance, the fiery general and the calculating tactician. Jackson had the fame, the rage, the will of the people. Van Buren? He had the machine. Together, they would reshape American politics forever. When Jackson lost the presidency in 1824, betrayed by backroom deals, Van Buren saw his opening. He whispered in Jackson's ear, stoking his fury, promising vengeance. And when the next election came in 1828, the machine roared to life. Dirt flew, newspapers screamed, opponents were smeared as aristocrats, as tyrants, as criminals. Van Buren's operatives turned out voters by the thousands, some living, some less so. And when the dust settled, Andrew Jackson stood victorious. But behind the throne, the real winner watched and waited. For Van Buren, the presidency was never the end game. It was the next move in a game only he truly understood. And as Jackson's right hand, he would soon discover that power isn't just about winning, it's about surviving. And the cost would be higher than he ever imagined. March 4th, 1837. The little magician ascends to the highest office in the land. He had spent a lifetime pulling strings from the shadows. Now, for the first time, the spotlight was his alone. But no amount of political sorcery could ward off the storm gathering on the horizon. Van Buren inherited wanted more than just the presidency from Andrew Jackson. He inherited a financial time bomb. Jackson's war against the National Bank had left the economy teetering on a knife's edge, and within weeks of Van Buren's inauguration, it collapsed. A montage of newspaper headlines: "Banks fail," "Panic in the streets," interspersed with frantic crowds outside shuttered banks. The Panic of 1837, a disaster unlike any America had seen. Banks folded, businesses crumbled, men who had been wealthy at sunrise stood penniless by dusk. And as the nation screamed for answers, all eyes turned to the new president, the man who had helped engineer this chaos. Van Buren knew the truth. The crisis wasn't just about banks or gold. It was about a system he had helped create, a system built on speculation, on paper promises, on political favors. And now it was consuming itself. His solution? A radical one. He would divorce the government from banks entirely. No federal deposits, no state favors, just an independent treasury untouched by the chaos. It was cold, logical, and politically suicidal. Angry political cartoons. Van Buren depicted as a miser hoarding gold, as a king ignoring starving citizens. The people didn't want logic, they wanted salvation. And as bread riots erupted and homeless families camped in the streets, Van Buren's aloof demeanor became a liability. The press crucified him. Former allies abandoned him. Even his beloved Democratic Party began to fracture. For the first time in his career, the master manipulator found himself trapped, not by enemies, but by circumstance. The very machine he had built now turned against him. And in the wings, a new force gathered strength. The Whigs, armed with slogans and a war hero to rally behind. The 1840 election would not be fought with policy or reason. It would be a spectacle, a carnival of log cabins and hard cider, of manufactured populism. And Van Buren, the architect of modern campaigning, would become its victim. Every trick has its final act. 1841. The little magician had lost everything. His presidency, his party, even his dignity, mocked in newspapers as Martin Van Buren. Most men would have faded into obscurity, retired to their estates, written their memoirs, and surrendered to history. But Van Buren was not most men. For 8 long years, he watched from the sidelines as the Whigs dismantled his life's work. Then, in 1848, the Democratic Party came calling once more. They needed him. America was at a crossroads. The question of slavery was tearing the nation apart, and Van Buren saw his chance at redemption. But this was not the Democratic Party he had built. The men who now controlled it were Southern fire eaters, demanding the expansion of slavery into new territories. Van Buren, the lifelong compromiser, faced an impossible choice: betray his conscience or betray his party. In the end, he chose neither. Instead, he did something no one expected. He joined the Free Soil Party, a ragtag coalition of abolitionists, disillusioned Democrats, and conscience-driven Whigs. At 65 years old, the man who had perfected political pragmatism was now running as a radical. The old machine was gone. No patronage, no backroom deals, just raw conviction. He barnstormed across the North, warning of slavery's slavocracy, speaking to crowds who remembered him as Jackson's puppet. Now, here he was, calling for the end of slavery's expansion. Had he changed? Or had America? He won not a single state, not even New York, his beloved empire. But something remarkable happened. Van Buren's Free Soilers siphoned enough votes to swing the election and ensure the slavery debate would never be silenced again. It was his final act in politics, not as a kingmaker, not as a president, but as a prophet, warning of the coming storm that would soon drown America in blood. Every magician must leave the stage, but the trick lives on. He died as he had lived, quietly, no fanfare, no grand eulogies, just the cold earth of his hometown closing over the man who had once bent American politics to his will. The newspapers barely noticed. The nation, now tearing itself apart in civil war, had forgotten the little magician. But history remembers what the living do not. In these final years, Van Buren became something rare among former presidents, a witness. He watched as the Democratic Party he built became the vehicle of Southern slave power. He watched as the Whigs collapsed, as new parties rose, as the country marched toward a war he had tried desperately to prevent. He never met Lincoln, never saw emancipation, but in his last writings, there was no bitterness, only clarity. He had been wrong about many things, but in the end, he chose right, and that perhaps was the greatest trick of all. We remember the giant. defiance. Washington's resolve, Jefferson's vision, Jackson's fury. But Van Buren's legacy is subtler. He taught politicians how to campaign, how to organize, how to survive. The modern presidency, the two-party system, even the messy spectacle of American democracy, these bear his fingerprints. The magician is gone, but the magic remains. Every conjurer knows the final rule of magic. The trick isn't complete until the audience stops looking for wires. And as America marched towards civil war, the greatest illusion Martin Van Buren ever performed was making the world forget he'd staged the show at all. His fingerprints linger where few think to look. That rally you attended, the lawn signs, the volunteers, the carefully crafted message, that's his invention. The attack ads, the spin rooms, the obsession with electability, his dark gifts to the Republic. We imagine our politics corrupted in recent years, but peel back the varnish and you'll find the rot goes back to that Albany tavern where a bartender's son first understood democracy doesn't go to the best man, it goes to the best player. He died just as the cannons roared at Shiloh. The war he predicted but couldn't prevent, the system he built but couldn't control, and when they buried him in Kinderhook, they interred something far more consequential than a failed president. They buried the architect of American politics itself. The curtain falls, the house lights rise. But ask yourself, when the next magician takes the stage, will you see the wires this time